So thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon, and if you couldn't make it, then thanks for listening to the recorded version instead. This is the podcast for first-time managers who are working in tech-driven businesses and teams and who want to be more effective people-first leaders. Join me each week to learn crucial strategies, mindsets and practical tips employed by successful modern leaders, enabling them to be more engaging, more ethical and more authentic managers who will get the best from their teams. And we achieve all of this through weekly conversations with other leaders, with leadership experts, entrepreneurs and business owners, people who have already walked this path and have some really amazing insights and stories to share. And there's also the added sprinkling now of these occasional solo episodes and a few group chats every now and then as well, where we'll have more than one guest. My name is David Hatch and I will be your host, in case you've not guessed already. Leadership has always been a passion for me, but after a career spent in a series of small businesses, 15 odd years in the aerospace industry and a space startup as well at the end of that, and having worked for more than a few bad leaders, as well as a couple of good ones to be fair, what I've learned from all of that is that the secret to successful management is in your ability to apply great leadership. And the secret in turn to great leadership lies in integrity, putting people before profits and basically not being an a-hole. And so Leading with Integrity was born. Today, I'm all about helping new managers be more effective, more engaging and more successful as leaders, whilst also avoiding burnout, stress, disinterested staff, and all those other unpleasant problems that will tend to crop up around bad leadership and toxic cultures. I care about this, particularly for new managers, because making that transition from practitioner to manager, from doing the work to leading the work, can be the most difficult thing many people will face in their career, but it's almost certainly going to be the most difficult thing so far. It's also that career stage where you're going to be least likely to get access to leadership training, leadership development. I've walked that path myself. It's not easy, especially if you have no training or support available from your employer. So that's who I am and why I do what I do. And one of the ways that I try to help is with this podcast.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the concept of the benevolent dictator and why, despite sounding like a nice thing, it's probably not something you want to actually implement as a leader. And so that's really all tied up in an approach to management that's called autocratic leadership. So to begin with, I thought it would be useful if we clarify what we actually mean by a benevolent dictator. In the realm of management and leadership, a benevolent dictator is this individual with the absolute authority and control over any decision-making within an organization. However, unlike the run-of-the-mill, the political type of dictator who may rule with that iron fist, the benevolent one is said to have the best interests of their employees, their organization, their people at heart. And that's all very hyperbolic and dramatic, isn't it? So what does it actually mean in the context of the average workplace? That's where this phrase autocratic leadership comes in. And when we think about traditional ideas of leadership, what it looks like, how it works, who does it, etc., the approach that usually comes to mind is this top-down hierarchy, the multi-level org chart where length of service equals seniority and seniority equals decision-making, but where that ultimate and final decision power rests with the person at the very top of the chart. Each leader below that top level is probably also practicing autocratic leadership over their own small group or team as well. And when you work within that kind of structure, it feels very dictatorial in style. Although I personally prefer to use words like autocracy because I don't think it's that fair? I don't think there's many business leaders out there who also fit the mold of actual dictators of history. So it's maybe a bit of an unfair comparison. But anyway, so the difference, I think, between a benevolent dictator and a normal one, in inverted commas, can be quite subtle. They'll still conform to the model of final decision authority. But I think where it changes, where it differs, is in the expectations. And that could be the expectations of others who will maybe see a benevolent dictator as the kind of autocrat who is going to use that power wisely and for more than just their own ends. And the expectations of the leader themselves as well, who will likely have a more positive view of their own behaviour than others, perhaps, as is human nature. In practice, the main difference tends to be around the actual decision making. While a leader like this will always maintain their final authority, they'll always have that final veto power, when they're more benevolent, they will also be more willing to delegate some of that authority, allow other decisions to be made without their direct involvement. Now, I don't know about you, but what I've just described there is pretty much every boss I've ever worked for. So let's talk a bit more about autocracy and what it actually is. The foundation behind any dictatorial approach, benevolent or otherwise, is in autocracy. And it's a word, forgive me for going down the dictionary definition route, but it's taken from in ancient Greek originally. So kratia or krasi, the second half of the word, meaning power, and auto meaning self or the individual, as opposed to democracy, where demo means people. And so the origin of the word is quite interesting because its meaning pretty well describes what this approach to management is all about. It's very much focused on power and authority. It's one of the oldest models of leadership. It's been around for quite a long time, and it's been closely associated with those more kind of regimented, strict organizations where there will be a single leader in any group. That leader centralizes all the decision making to themselves, the authority and control, and rarely, if ever, consults their team members. I would say colleagues, but they tend not to view anyone as colleagues. And it's still surprisingly prevalent in many modern businesses, despite clearly being more relevant to a non-business kind of setting, such as perhaps the military. Typical statements of autocratic leaders might include the simple directive kind of instructions like do this, do that, go over there, along with rationalizations akin to the sort of thing you might expect a parent to say to a young child, because I'm the boss, because I said so. And responses to questions or issues or feedback that are often similar or variations on a theme of, you don't need to know why, just do as you're told. Do as I say, not as I do. And when I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. Or more likely, just simply, I don't want your opinion. Now, I have to admit, there are some clear strengths to using this approach, which is perhaps why it has survived and persisted for so long in the face of the many alternative approaches to leadership that have emerged over the last 100 years or so. And what are those strengths? Well, primarily, and this is the one that I hear most often, is that it lends itself to quick decisions, decisive action. And yes, I acknowledge that can be particularly crucial in certain environments, in crisis response, occasions where there's a rapid response that's necessary, maybe when lives are on the line, for example. And autocratic methods can be quite productive in the short term, or even perhaps when working with inexperienced team members, such as an early career individual, a new hire, and so on. And it has even been argued that if the followers are accepting and acknowledging of the autocracy and they are happy with it, then it can in many ways produce a more productive, even psychologically safe working environment, perhaps even leading to higher morale. Not been my experience, but it's a point of view that has been raised. Using the word benevolent suggests that this sort of leader is compassionate, is kind-hearted, genuinely cares about their employees' well-being. And yes, some or all of those things may well be true. They may even take actions that seem beneficial, perhaps only on the surface, such as offering generous benefits and perks to their staff. However, I think what's essential to understand about autocratic leadership, even when labelled as benevolent, is that it does have inherent flaws and limitations. And we'll come back to those a bit later. So all of that makes sense. It sounds like being a benevolent dictator could be quite effective. After all, as long as you mean well, are benevolent, what's the problem? Why shouldn't you adopt this approach in your team? It does seem like a pretty simple way of managing people, and superficially that is true, which is maybe why so many people and businesses fall back on this approach even today. But some of those examples that I talked about just now have perhaps already given you an idea, or maybe even a flashback to a previous boss, of how this style of leadership can make their followers feel about their leader, about their role, about themselves. So what are the real dangers then of being an autocratic leader in your team, in your business, even for the long-term viability of your leadership? Well, I have done a little bit of primary research on this topic over the last few years. Most recently, and I hesitate to call this research, but most recently is a poll that I ran on LinkedIn a couple of months back. And the question for that was, which of these approaches is the biggest mistake a leader can make in your experience? Now, as it was a LinkedIn poll, I can only provide 4 options, so it's not the most robust piece of research. But the options I went with were, I don't want your opinion, which scored highest with 47% of the votes. Then we had do as I say, not as I do, which came second with 26% of the votes. And then I'll watch everything you do in third place with 21%. And at number 4 was let's be friends with 5%. That was weirdly fun. I felt a bit like a DJ there, or a Top of the Pops presenter for a minute. Anyway, back on topic, David. Right. So you'll have noticed that the top 2 highest responses to that question, what's the biggest mistake a leader can make, are behaviours that are straight out of the autocratic playbook. I'd already used those phrases earlier this episode, in fact. The third describes more of a micromanagement kind of approach, which does usually fit with autocracy. It tends to be more associated with styles like transactional leadership, but it still mostly fits. And then from my own academic research that I've done as well, there's a few themes around autocratic or dictator style leadership that have cropped up quite a bit. Key examples being about the lack of respect that's given to people's opinions, their contributions, their time, how treating people like school children and acting like the big boss wasn't the most effective way to lead. And leading by example also came up as an important way to get leadership right that autocracy totally misses, and that whole do as I say, not as I do mindset, which tends to result in a negative culture and is usually seen as a giant red flag, not just for current, but also prospective employees. What it really boils down to, though, are there's 2 big problems with autocratic leadership, especially when we look at it in the context of our modern, fast-paced, rapidly changing workplaces. The first of those is that it's quite difficult to sustain a high-performing organisation with this type of leadership, especially if your company or your workforce are highly skilled, knowledge-based, and in a high-demand industry. See also tech-driven businesses. Secondly, autocracy stifles innovation. It diminishes initiative. It stifles creativity in your team. Because if the leader is only taking their own account or their own view into account, if they're centralizing authority within themselves and they're not listening to others, then people are going to stop bringing them ideas or problems. Other issues include the fact that over extended periods of time, autocracy has been shown to reduce staff engagement and job satisfaction, which is no surprise given those 2 problems, the big problems that I just mentioned. And the more highly skilled and more knowledge-based the team members are, and the more expertise they have, the more damaging that impact becomes, because all of that knowledge, skill, expertise is effectively being ignored. When decisions are made solely by the leader, by one individual, it creates this culture of dependency where employees will feel disempowered, undervalued. This lack of involvement in the decision-making process can lead to demotivation, lower job satisfaction, ultimately decreased productivity, which hurts the bottom line of the business as well. It can also lead to a quite unhealthy power dynamic and even a toxic workplace. When you have that situation where a leader is possessing absolute authority, it can create an environment for fear and intimidation as well. We've already talked a bit about how it stifles innovation, creativity and ideas, but it also goes further. It diminishes that open communication. It inhibits collaboration. Employees may hesitate to voice their opinions or share their ideas, as I've mentioned, but more importantly, they might fear repercussions or dismissal if they bring problems and issues. And that's a huge problem for any leader, because if you want to be effective at problem solving as a team, you've got to be hearing about the problems. So allowing that environment of fear to stop people from reporting issues is a potential business killer, more so than suppressing new ideas, although of course that's damaging too. And there's been a couple of quite high profile examples of that, particularly in the context of safety culture in aerospace, where people didn't feel able to raise problems or flag mistakes. And ultimately, in some cases, it led to loss of life because there were unsafe practices. Again, it may be no surprise by now to hear that autocratic leadership has also been linked to lower financial performance and even to workplace bullying. So with all of that in mind, here is the fundamental reason why even calling yourself benevolent while you act like a dictator won't work. And I can sum it up in a single word, and that word is respect. Even when a leader claims to be benevolent as they do this, or is perceived that way by others, the fundamental issue with autocratic leadership remains. While they may genuinely believe that they're acting in the best interest of their employees, the concentration of individual power in one person's hands can distort that perspective. It prevents them from fully understanding the diverse needs and experiences of their team. They're not respecting their team members' experience, their knowledge, their opinions, their skills, or in some of the more extreme cases, even their humanity. Adding the word benevolent really does nothing to mitigate or avoid those negative consequences that come with autocratic leadership. But even if it did, there is still strong and well-established evidence that autocracy will underperform against more modern leadership methods. And it's for the same reason. It fails to leverage all of those diverse and combined skill sets of other team members, and it creates that single bottleneck for decision making. So it's not as efficient as it may seem at first glance. And despite all of this, there are still loads of benevolent dictators and autocratic leaders in workplaces the world over. And you may ask why. And that is a very good question. Here's what I think the answer to that question is. It's because it's quite a simple structure. It's easy to understand, it's easy to implement. You don't need a management consultant to come in and help you with it. Anyone who's seen leadership on TV or in the big budget movies will probably understand autocratic leadership. And it also, I think, requires leaders to have fewer conversations where they might have to explain or gain understanding or achieve buy-in. So it seems easier. It can seem attractive to the busy, time-poor manager who's got all those many, many plates spinning. And even when you think of it in terms of a big corporation, again, it's simpler. The bigger and more complex the organization, the more attractive this kind of approach is going to be. So the big question then, if you're in an autocratic environment, what can you do about it? And I should caveat that and say, it might be working for you. If it is, great. I'd actually love to hear about that experience. You don't need to do anything because it's working for you and you're happy. Well done. Great. You can stop listening, I guess. If that's not the case, there's two angles to come at this problem from. If you're the leader, or if you're not, if you're having an issue with another leader or your own manager. So as the leader, let's do scenario one first, you have a lot more control over this than you may think. Even as a new manager at a relatively junior level of a hierarchy in a larger business, you will still have the main say over how you are going to interact with the people who you lead on any given day. So the first step I would advise is some self-reflection. How have you been taking decisions? Are you communicating and interacting in a positive way? Are your team productive and happy? And yes, that last one can be difficult to measure as a leader, because there is that whole dynamic, isn't there, of put on a brave face for the boss, laugh at the boss's jokes, all that kind of stuff. But have a think about it, really proper think, and see what you can discern from some of the behaviours of your team. And then the next step, simplest way to get an answer about how someone feels is ask them. If you're brave enough, you might try doing it with everyone at once, the whole team. You'd be braver than me if you did try that. Probably better to start one-on-one and maybe do that one later. Ask people for feedback. Be clear from the outset, there's going to be no recriminations or rewards. You're just trying to learn and understand about your own performance, and you want to be a better leader. Find out how they perceive your leadership. Ask them what works best for them as followers, and then try to use that information to plan any adjustments that might be needed to the way that you're working. In scenario 2, let's call it, if you're the follower and you're struggling with a difficult autocratic leader who's just not helping you perform in the way that you know you can, then that is quite a different dynamic, and that will likely need a bit more patience from you. The first thing to remember is that in most of those kinds of situations, in most cases, those leaders, those managers are not behaving that way maliciously. They're not doing it because they don't like you or because they think they're more important. Well, maybe because they think they're more important than you. They're not doing it because they don't value you necessarily and your opinions. It's more likely that they're just behaving this way, they're following this autocratic path because that's the way they've seen it done. That's the way they were managed when they were in your shoes. That's the way they believe you are supposed to manage people. And that's not necessarily their fault any more than it is yours. Having said that, it might mean they will be more open to feedback than you expect. So the first suggestion I would have here is, again, it's fairly simple, but it's open that conversation. Speak to them. Have the chat with them on the basis that their approach to leading you is not working for you. If you're able to make that less about them and more about your way of working, your personality, then it's likely to also help you avoid that kind of ego and defensive response that you might get, and it might make the conversation go a bit more smoothly. So maybe just open that conversation with, look, boss, I'm having a tough time with this. The way that you're giving instructions and explaining the tasks, I'm not understanding it. Can we maybe explore some alternative ways of working? And make it as non-confrontational as you can. This is also a pretty good way to find out actually if you've got a long-term potential for this working relationship, because if you get an immediate response of no or some variation along those lines, then it's going to be pretty clear to you that inevitably, sooner or later, you're going to reach a point of no return, and this isn't going to be the place for you in the long run, which is less of a problem these days than it used to be, but it could be a good early warning sign, early red flag for you to start that job hunt early. Something else I want to stress, though, is that no is not the most likely outcome. Unless you're really unlucky and you do have that 1 in 10 horrible person as your manager, which I'm sure won't be the case. The chances are they just simply haven't realised the impact they're having on you. They've not appreciated that the way they're behaving is even autocratic leadership. Once it's pointed out to you, any decent human or manager is probably going to be open to working with you and adjusting what they're doing, because ultimately they want to get the best from you as well. They want to get the job done. That's their role here. So there might be that kind of short period of embarrassment or maybe defensiveness, depending on how that initial conversation goes. But with a bit of grace, a bit of kindness, I think it will help in both scenarios actually, and in both directions. And just remember that everyone is human, everyone makes mistakes, and if you don't tell them, they might not realise. So that's my take on autocratic leadership. Hopefully you can see why it's not the best thing to adopt in the modern workplace. And hopefully I've also given you some useful ideas for how to deal with it if it is a challenge that you're facing at work right now. If you have found this episode useful and you would like to learn more about some of the alternatives to autocracy in our workplace and what techniques modern people-driven leaders use, then good news, I have a short course to get you started. You will learn the tactics, the priorities, the behaviours that I employed myself in my own leadership, and it will help you be a more effective manager. That course will take you a few days at most. It's going for a great price right now. And if that sounds good, there will be a link in the episode description or in the comments on LinkedIn, depending on where you are. Just click on that, enter your details, and I'll be in touch soon. I hope you'll join me again next week. We've got another 2 episodes. For Podcast Wednesday, I'm going to be interviewing Ira Lupanen, a leadership expert and advocate for emotional agency at work. And then we're going to have another bonus solo episode like this one, coming on Friday next week. And in that one, I'm going to be talking about some of the things followers have told me about their leaders and what lessons might be able to learn from those little stories. Well, that's it from me. Thank you again to everyone who's listening, whether you're with us live on LinkedIn or you're catching the recorded edition later this week. Either way, I hope to see you again next week. Thank you again. And in the meantime, remember, be a leader, not a boss.